Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most baffling, ridiculously soft, and financially disastrous obsessions in European aristocratic history. A single pair of silk socks that somehow bankrupted a French noble. Now I know what you're thinking. Socks? Really? But stay with me. This isn't just about footwear. It's about vanity, velvet, Versailles, and one man's descent into absurdity. One step at a time. You're not going to survive this story if you're expecting plot twists. Spoiler alert, it's 98% fabric. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is, because yes, this is the kind of story best heard at 2:47 a.m. with a warm drink and zero expectations. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through the alleys of 18th century Lyon, France's silk capital, early spring. The air smells faintly of dye, coal smoke, and whatever passed for fresh back then. There's something cozy about it. The cobblestones are damp from last night's rain, and your shoes, of course, are the kind that weren't designed for practicality, because no self-respecting noble wears boots that actually work. Your destination? A small atelier nestled between a cheese shop and what might be a church. Though there's definitely a man sleeping outside with a goat. Inside this workshop, something ridiculous is about to be created. A pair of socks so luxurious, so elaborate, they'll make wigs seem modest. You push open the wooden door and immediately hear the soft rhythm of weaving looms. The silk glistens faintly under candlelight, stretched across wooden frames like spider webs dipped in moonlight. It's all very romantic until you sneeze from the dust and a loom operator glares at you like you just offended their grandmother. These are not ordinary socks. They are being made for the Marquess of Fauchon. And if that name sounds familiar, it's probably because he once tried to have someone arrested for mispronouncing it. The order is precise: imported Chinese silk, dyed in indigo, mixed with crushed violets, and this is real, infused with ambergris. That's right. Whale perfume. For socks. Because nothing screams stepping in style like the scent of a sperm whale's digestive system. You're handed a scrap of the fabric to feel. It's softer than baby cheeks, softer than apologies from someone who's clearly still mad. It melts in your palm. It almost makes you want to commit financial self-destruction yourself. The master weaver, Etienne, is muttering to himself in the corner. He's been working without sleep for 2 days because, apparently, the Marquess specified that the socks must not only glow faintly in candlelight, but must also whisper against the skin like a secret lover. That's either poetry or a cry for help. You step back outside just in time to see a messenger racing toward you on horseback. He's covered in mud, the feather in his hat is limp, and he has the dead-eyed stare of someone who's been yelled at by nobility for the 5th time this week. In his hand, a sealed letter, a revised request. The Marquess now wants the socks slightly tighter at the ankle because his recent weight loss, due to a cabbage-based diet trend, has made his legs nobly slender. You think about your own legs and sigh. Back at the chateau, the Marquess of Fauchon himself is pacing. You can hear the heels of his embroidered slippers click across the marble. He's practicing walking like he's about to be seen by someone important, which, to be fair, is always. For him, every hallway is a runway. He's muttering to a mirror, rehearsing compliments that he imagines the court will say. Things like, "Oh, monsieur, those socks, they shimmer with melancholy." Or, "My heavens, are those ocean silk?" That last one makes no sense. He likes it anyway. Fauchon isn't just dressing up for a party, he's making a statement. He believes that how one dresses reveals the quality of one's soul. So, naturally, his soul requires socks that cost more than a vineyard. Here's where it starts to get tricky. The Marquess doesn't have the money to pay for these socks, but that won't stop him. He opens a new line of credit from a banker named Claret, who has a mustache so twirled it deserves its own title. Claret raises an eyebrow but signs the loan. He's used to nobles being ridiculous. What no one realizes yet is that this single transaction will set off a chain of events involving opera house scandals, debt collectors with a passion for poetry, and a duel over sock etiquette. But that's all later. Right now, you're in a quiet room in Lyon, watching silk turn into temptation. Somewhere in the distance, bells toll softly, and you wonder what people will say about this centuries from now. Will they marvel at the elegance or snort with laughter at the priorities? You already know the answer. And somewhere, probably in the corner of this very workshop, a cat curls up on a roll of rejected silk and starts purring. Because even in a world obsessed with appearances, softness always wins. You return to the chateau a few days later, your feet sore, your coat faintly perfumed with dye and regret, to find the Marquess of Fauchon standing in the center of his salon like a man awaiting news of war. Except the war is style and the battlefield is below the knees. He doesn't say hello. He doesn't ask about your trip. He simply holds out his hand for the package. His fingers tremble with anticipation as he unties the pale blue ribbon, specially chosen to match his veins, apparently. When he finally unfolds the socks, he gasps. "These," he whispers, "are too divine." You stand there, waiting for a nod of approval, maybe a polite thank you. But instead, Fauchon begins to cry. Just a little. One single tear rolls down his powdered cheek and lands directly on the silk. He blinks in horror. You'd think he just stabbed a duchess. A valet rushes in with a cloth, dabbing the moisture away like it's holy water. A backup pair of gloves is fetched. The socks are set on a velvet cushion, carried off to be aired before wearing. This is a man who hasn't paid his staff in 2 months. Later that evening, Fauchon prepares for what he calls the debut. It's not a ball, not a formal court event. No, it's a garden gathering of about 12 mildly influential people who mostly gossip and try not to spill drinks on statues. But to Fauchon, it's Versailles or bust. He sits in front of the mirror while 2 assistants fluff his cravat and one carefully buffs his ears. Yes, his ears. He insists they shimmer. He slips the socks on slowly, one toe at a time, eyes fluttering shut in some kind of fashion ecstasy. And then, disaster. The socks are perfect, perhaps too perfect. They're so smooth, his shoes won't stay on properly. They slide, there's a moment of wobble. He stares at his reflection in horror. Do my ankles jiggle? They don't. Of course they don't. But now the idea is planted. The Marquess grabs a nearby bell and rings it with the intensity of someone summoning ghosts. A footman arrives out of breath. "Bring the beige ones," he says. The horror in the room is palpable. The beige socks, the cotton ones, the ones from last season. You watch as the courtier's mouth opens in protest, but the words die on his tongue. This is serious. This is sock treason. Still, Fauchon regains composure. He swaps the socks again, this time hiding the silk pair in a hand-carved ivory drawer, almost ashamed, but not for long. No, he promises himself, next week's soiree at the opera will be their true moment. And then, the world will understand, except the opera's going to be a little dramatic. Meanwhile, debts pile up. The tailor Etienne sends a polite invoice tied with a gold thread. The banker Claret sends a reminder by Raven, because why not? And Fauchon, he shrugs, sips rosewater, and spends an hour arranging dried lavender into the shape of Italy on his dressing table. He claims it's for stress relief. Here's a little-known truth. Nobles in the 18th century often had entire rooms just for mood regulation. Called retiring salons, these were places to sigh deeply while someone plays the harp in the corner. You peek into Fauchon's. There are 6 fainting couches, one for each emotional state. He lies down on the financial despair one. You recognize it because it's upholstered in sad green, and still he won't let go of the socks. He begins practicing what he calls the silk stride, a walk that lets just enough ankle show while implying nothing is being shown. You watch him pace back and forth like a confused flamingo. Then comes the first incident. A dinner guest notices a slight glint under Fauchon's trouser cuff and dares to ask, "Are those silk?" Fauchon's reaction is swift. Denial. "Cotton blend," he says, eyes twitching. "I'm frugal now." The room goes quiet. Everyone knows it's a lie. One woman gasps into her soup. You think this is getting out of hand, but the Marquess doesn't care. He retires early that night, slipping back into the socks like a man putting on armor. In the flickering candlelight, he lifts one foot, admires it, and whispers, "Perfection. Shame is temporary. Texture is forever." You want to laugh, but he kind of has a point. Outside, the wind picks up. Rain begins to fall again, tapping softly against the windows. Somewhere down the hall, a servant snores with the weary rhythm of someone who's seen too many unnecessary costume changes. You lie down on the guest bed. The mattress is a bit lumpy, stuffed with feathers and secrets. The walls flicker with shadows from the fire, and just as your eyelids start to drift shut, you hear a quiet voice from the next room. "Maurice," the Marquess murmurs to no one in particular. "We need to talk about my ankles. They demand respect." You smile into the pillow. "Tomorrow, the opera. And the socks? They're not ready for what's coming." Morning breaks like overcooked eggs, wet, runny, and somehow already cold. The chateau smells faintly of lavender, floor wax, and desperation. You awaken to the sound of a servant outside the door, whispering the daily schedule like it's a death sentence. Breakfast, foot powder, gloves steaming, opera fittings, and debt suppression. You swing your legs over the side of the bed and feel a faint tremble in the floorboards. Not an earthquake, just the Marquess of Fauchon practicing his grand entrance down the stairs again. You hear the rhythmic click, click, slide, curse, and know that once again the silk socks are causing footwear-related issues. He's determined to make them work. This evening is the Opera Gala, an annual event where all of Paris's most irritatingly rich people gather to pretend to like music. For Fauchon, it's the runway of the year. He plans to debut the socks during the overture and let them casually appear while adjusting his knee. This entire performance has been rehearsed more than the opera itself. You're handed a silver tray with a single croissant and a note. The note reads, "You are summoned to the salon. Wear something emotionally neutral." You arrive to find Fauchon already mid-drama. He's draped across the chaise in a robe that can only be described as aggressive. It's all peacock feathers and crushed velvet, like a couch at war with itself. "I had a dream," he says. "In it, the socks turned against me." You blink slowly. "They refused to be seen," he whispers. "They curled inward like frightened shrimp." You pour yourself tea and nod. You've learned it's best not to interrupt his metaphors before noon. Still, he's clearly anxious. So much rides on tonight. He's already called the perfumer to adjust his scent. Less moonlit library and more enigmatic thunderstorm. He's even having the driver polish the carriage wheels to reflect his inner glow. But underneath the drama is something else. Debt. Fauchon's finances are not just precarious, they're performing Cirque du Soleil above a pit of unpaid invoices. You check the drawer. The socks are still there, wrapped in violet tissue paper, surrounded by sprigs of dried mint. A tiny sachet of rose petals sits inside, because apparently even footwear requires aromatherapy. Later that day, a package arrives from the tailor Etienne. Inside is a note written in outrageously delicate script. "My lord, these socks were meant for elegance, not exertion. Please remember to walk as though you are not walking." Also enclosed is a small bottle labeled sock adhesive for emergency slippage. Evening arrives. The sun dips below the city like it's trying to avoid eye contact with the aristocracy. The opera house glows with candlelight and ambition. You ride in a gilded carriage with wheels that squeak in an expensive way. Inside, Fauchon is silent, focused. You step out onto the cobblestone. The crowd parts. Whispers begin. "Is that him? Look at the embroidery. Do his knees sparkle?" Fauchon does not rush. He ascends the steps like a man who knows angels are watching. Each footstep lands with the precision of a ticking clock. Inside, the chandeliers blaze. People fan themselves, not because it's hot, but because it's dramatic. The opera begins. You take your seat, the overture swells, and then it happens. At exactly the moment the violins crescendo, Fauchon crosses one leg over the other, slowly, deliberately, and the sock is revealed. Gasps. Audible gasps. A duchess drops her opera glass. A gentleman's monocle literally pops out. One woman whispers, "My stars," and promptly faints. For a moment, Fauchon looks triumphant, but only for a moment. You hear it first, a faint creak, then a snap. Then, horror. One shoe begins to slide, slowly, visibly, like a sad gondola escaping its dock. The sock, too smooth, too glorious, cannot hold its ground. The shoe teeters, tips, and with a graceful thud lands in the lap of a magistrate 3 rows down. The orchestra falters. The audience freezes. Fauchon freezes. You freeze. No one moves for exactly 7 seconds. Then someone claps, just once. The sound rings out like a gunshot, then silence again. Fauchon clears his throat, stands, bows slightly, whispers, "Fashion is pain," then hobbles off stage left. Back in the carriage, there are no words. He stares out the window. The city glows gold and soft and indifferent. Finally, he speaks. They weren't ready, he says. The world wasn't ready. You say nothing. You offer him a flask of mint tea laced with whatever herbal potion the kitchen staff has started brewing specifically for emergency humiliation recovery. He drinks. He sighs. Back at the chateau, he removes the socks with the care of a surgeon. They are placed back in the drawer. You notice a new item has joined them, a small note card with only 2 words, handwritten in elegant script, "Not yet." You lie in bed that night, the image of the flying shoe still vivid, the silence of the opera house still ringing in your ears. Somewhere down the hall, you hear Fauchon murmuring in his sleep. Too radiant, too radiant. You wonder what tomorrow will bring, and then you sleep. You wake to the sound of shoes being rehearsed. Yes, shoes. Not worn, not walked in, rehearsed. Somewhere in the long corridor of Fauchon's chateau, you hear precise pacing punctuated by sharp turns and occasional muttered phrases like heel, heel, glide, no, glide, heel, then pause, with longing. You pull a curtain back to check the weather. Mist again. France seems permanently stuck in what might be called overcast with aristocratic guilt. The kind of morning where even the birds look unsure about commitment. Downstairs, the servants have started referring to the previous night's opera incident simply as the shoe, whispered, reverent, like it's a proper noun now. One even suggests having a miniature monument made for the foyer. Another offers to polish the fallen shoe and hang it over the mantel like a hunting trophy. In the breakfast salon, because yes, there are multiple salons, including one for toast, the Marquess is unusually quiet. His hair is still perfectly powdered, but his mood is subdued, like a man who just realized he's overdrawn on both style and solvency. He dips his croissant in jam with tragic precision. They clapped, he mutters. At least one did. You nod. Yes, it might have been a nervous twitch or applause, who's to say? But underneath the shame is something you hadn't expected. Resolve. He's planning a comeback. The socks, he whispers, deserve redemption. A second act. And this time, we plan. That afternoon, he sends a letter, dictated while wearing his robe of contemplation, gray silk, trimmed in mood. The letter is to Etienne the tailor, requesting a meeting. We must rethink grip, without compromising grace. You ride with him to Lyon again, but the mood is different now. Less theatrical, more strategic. Fauchon takes notes, real notes, with a pen, on paper. It's almost alarming. Etienne greets you with mild irritation, a lavender-scented handkerchief, and a tray of plum tarts. He sets down the half-finished embroidery of a pair of gloves and says, "So, the socks slipped." Fauchon stares at him. "They betrayed me." Etienne shrugs. "Or perhaps you asked too much. Even silk has limits." You all sit. There's a long discussion involving materials, physics, and something Etienne refers to as micro-traction elasticity. You're not sure that's a real term. It might just be tailor nonsense. But it sounds impressive. They consider adding a discreet band of woven cashmere around the arch. "It will ground the heel," Etienne says, without ruining the caress. He says this like he's describing a love affair, not footwear. Outside, a delivery boy crashes into a goose. No one flinches. You've become immune to absurdity. Later that evening, back at the chateau, Fauchon lays the revised prototype across the chaise. He doesn't wear it yet. He just looks at it, like a general studying a map before battle. You ask what the plan is. He smiles faintly. A dinner. Small, controlled, with conversation, not crowds, no sudden movements, and only carpeted floors. It's strangely rational. The next day, invitations are sent. An evening of moderated elegance, the cards read. Gentle music, gentle lighting, gentle everything. And at the bottom, no dancing. The guests arrive at dusk, only 10 of them, carefully selected for their discretion and, frankly, their terrible vision. Fauchon greets them wearing the new socks, now stitched with hidden stabilizers. He glides, not walks, glides across the room. The rug muffles any drama. The lighting is soft, everyone smells like vanilla and old money. And it works. No slippage. No wardrobe malfunctions. One lady compliments the shimmer of confidence in his stride. Someone offers him a fig tart without sarcasm. But just as the evening hits its elegant peak, the Marquess's butler leans in and whispers something into his ear. You see the color drain from Fauchon's face. "Who?" he says. "Here?" The butler nods. He's in the foyer. Claims to be a collector. You step into the hall, and there he is. Maurice. You don't know Maurice yet, but you will. Everyone does eventually. He's tall, impeccably dressed, and carries a leather-bound notebook like it's more dangerous than a pistol. He smiles, warmly, disturbingly, like someone who truly enjoys what he does. "I'm here," he says, "to discuss some unresolved financial fabrics." Debt collector, but not just any. Maurice specializes in noble complications. He once repossessed a duke's wig mid-duel. He is legend. You escort him to the side parlor, trying to shield him from the guests. The Marquess follows, pale but composed. Maurice opens his book. Page after page of entries. 17 unpaid invoices, he says. 8 ignored notes. 1 minor opera incident with a shoe. Fauchon tries to laugh. Maurice does not. Then he leans in. "But I'm not without heart," he says. "I appreciate beauty, craftsmanship, especially when it ruins someone." And then he pulls from his satchel a parchment with Fauchon's signature. "Repayment in full," he says, "or collateral." "What sort of collateral?" Fauchon whispers. Maurice smiles. "Just one item. Nothing much. Something soft, silken, possibly violet." There's a pause so heavy it creaks. You look to Fauchon. His hand moves involuntarily to his ankle. Protective, defensive. And then, with a sigh that could have narrated a novel, he says, "They're not just socks." Maurice nods. "They never are." Section. You expect a dramatic refusal, a flurry of powdered indignation, perhaps even a fainting spell onto one of the emergency settees. But instead, the Marquess just stands there. Still. Too still. Maurice remains perfectly calm. That's the thing about him. He doesn't threaten you. He simply waits for your sense of dignity to buckle under the weight of unpaid silk. "I could," Maurice says, brushing imaginary lint from his lapel, "take the chandelier going, or perhaps that little portrait of you gazing wistfully at a bowl of grapes. But socks are personal, and I deal in personal." You glance at Fauchon's feet. They're hidden now beneath a sweep of embroidered linen. But you know they're still in there, those socks. The upgraded, cashmere-balanced, emotionally reinforced socks. He's barely taken them off since the opera, and now someone wants to seize them. Fauchon clears his throat. "You understand, Maurice? These are no longer just garments." "Of course," Maurice replies smoothly. "They're chapters, regrets, footnotes in your autobiography." He smiles with teeth. "I'm quite the reader." There's a long pause. The fire crackles. Somewhere upstairs, a harpsichord plays itself, badly. A guest coughs politely in another room, unaware that the history of anklewear teeters on a razor's edge. Then Fauchon straightens. "I will not surrender the socks." Maurice raises an eyebrow. Instead, Fauchon glides, over to the secretary desk and begins to write. Fast. Flourish after flourish of ink curls across the paper. You peek over his shoulder. He's issuing a formal declaration of artistic exemption. Apparently, nobles can appeal to the Bureau des Objets Noblement Inutiles, a real office that exists for the sole purpose of defending items so extravagantly pointless they become culturally protected. Maurice peers at the letter. This hasn't been used since the Count of Chanterelle tried to protect his gold-plated egg whisk. Fauchon snaps the wax seal with a flourish, and he succeeded. You escort Maurice to the door. He accepts the letter, folds it, and tucks it into his satchel. "You've bought yourself time," he says, already turning away. But silk waits for no man. He disappears into the mist like a fable nobody asked for. Back inside, Fauchon collapses into a chair. "Well," he exhales, "that was close." You nod. "You've stalled the collector, but not the debt." "No." He stares into the fire, his ankles softly luminous. You think maybe this is the moment he turns around, learns to live within his means, begins wearing cotton. But no, instead he begins drafting an invitation for a sock salon. "An exclusive gathering of textile minds," he murmurs aloud as he writes. "Discussion, admiration, light refreshments." You don't even flinch anymore. He'll invite only the finest, a textile historian, a fashion poet, a duchess who owns 84 parasols and allegedly once wore a cravat to bed. Meanwhile, to keep the wolves at bay, Fauchon begins selling off small possessions. Nothing dramatic, just a few duplicates. A second snuff box, a third mirror, one of the lesser wigs, but he won't sell the socks. Never the socks. The day of the sock salon arrives. The drawing room has been transformed. Fabrics hang from the ceiling in sweeping loops. A harpist plucks variations on themes from La Tristesse du Pied, a fictional opera Fauchon invented for the occasion. Guests arrive, fluttering in like drowsy butterflies. They sip rose tea. They debate sock lineage. One man brings a magnifying glass and begins comparing weaves like a suspicious jeweler. Fauchon enters last, of course. He walks with the measured drama of someone who's just barely recovered from emotional collapse. His socks shimmer subtly, no longer blinding, but intelligent. A hush falls over the room. Someone mutters, "Art." He nods modestly. They're a blend now, a touch of grounded realism. The evening proceeds like an academic fever dream. Someone presents a chart of sock history, complete with dates and sketchy illustrations. Another reads a haiku about foot warmth. There's polite applause. Then the textile historian, a woman named Beatrice with 17 rings and no indoor voice, clears her throat. "Tell us," she booms, "what inspired this obsession?" All eyes turn to Fauchon. He pauses, dramatically, then leans forward. "Softness," he says. "In a hard world, the way silk forgives your shape, the way it wraps, not restrains. And yes, perhaps I sought too much beauty, but is that truly a crime?" There's silence. Then, applause. A guest sobs quietly into a napkin. The harpist plays a chord that somehow sounds like personal validation. The socks have won the room. You should be happy. But then you see Maurice again. He's in the corner, sipping tea, smiling. Somehow he got in. He walks up, slow and warm and terrible. "I admire it," he says. "The charm, the delusion, the sheer silkiness of it all." He takes a slow sip. "But you know this ends, don't you?" Fauchon nods. "Eventually. Soon. Probably." Maurice tips his hat. "I look forward to the ending." Then he turns and vanishes through the hallway curtain like a debt-shaped ghost. The guests never even noticed. Back in his chambers, Fauchon removes the socks carefully and places them in their lined drawer. He sits in silence for a while. "Do you think they understand?" he asks. "What it means to feel your socks?" You do. Unfortunately, so does Maurice. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you start wondering, how far will this really go? The next morning begins not with birdsong or breakfast trays, but with the sound of fabric being compared aloud to human emotions. You stumble into the main salon, half awake, to find Fauchon standing over a tapestry declaring, "Linen is polite, cotton is safe, but silk is dangerous in the way a love letter hidden inside a tax audit is dangerous." You blink. He's been up since dawn, maybe earlier. There's an empty plate of madeleines on the mantel and a half-finished sketch labeled Sock 2.0 sequel. He turns to you, eyes wide and glinting with something both manic and moisturized. "We have to go deeper, mon ami. These socks, they've only scratched the surface." And you realize with a quiet kind of dread that Fauchon has moved beyond obsession and directly into textile philosophy. He calls for the carriage. He's decided you must return to Lyon again, not to see Etienne the tailor, but to consult a retired silk dyer named Madame Mireille. She lives alone in a vine-draped cottage and is rumored to have once created a shade of blue so calming it was banned from military uniforms for making soldiers too thoughtful. The journey is long, bumpy, and entirely unnecessary. The countryside rolls by like a watercolor in denial. Fauchon spends most of it muttering into a journal about ankle aura and toe-based expression. By the time you arrive, Madame Mireille is already waiting. She's wrapped in layers of gauze and wears a scarf the size of a sail. She eyes Fauchon like a woman who's met many men like him and preferred most of them unconscious. "I know why you've come," she says before he even speaks. "You want silk that speaks, silk that seduces, silk that haunts dreams and cleanses reputations." Fauchon gasps. "Yes, exactly that." She motions for him to follow her into a dim room filled with bolts of fabric, each labeled not by color, but by emotion. Midsummer's hesitation, smirking forgiveness, regret at a gala. "Most nobles ask for power," she says. "You want softness, but softness with gravity, a rare poison." She pulls out a sample dyed a strange, swirling shade, somewhere between storm cloud and confession. She calls it silencieux. It whispers without saying sorry. Fauchon touches it and nearly passes out. Back at the chateau, the experiments begin. Etienne is summoned. Again, this time with 2 assistants, 3 looms, and a folding chair he refuses to explain. They set up shop in the East Gallery, working in shifts, whispering like cultists. Madame Mireille oversees dyeing, mixing crushed violet petals, aged wine, and something she claims is wind from a Tuesday. Meanwhile, Fauchon holds auditions for sock tassels. Yes, tassels. He wants them suggestive but tasteful. You watch him reject one that he claims feels like it's keeping secrets. The staff begins to show signs of fatigue. The cook leaves a tray of croissants that spell out "help" in raspberry glaze. A footman trips over a bolt of fabric and mutters, "Is this my life now?" to no one in particular. You, on the other hand, are slowly succumbing to the strange hypnotic rhythm of this ridiculous quest. There's something comforting about the structure, the folds, the textures, the emotional investment in ankle attire. You begin to understand why madness can sometimes feel like purpose. The day of unveiling arrives. The socks, Les Silencieux, are complete, and they are breathtaking. They shimmer in a way that suggests memory. They hug the ankle like a well-timed compliment. They mean something. Fauchon insists on wearing them first in total silence. He emerges from his dressing chamber like a man reborn. Everyone in the room inhales sharply. One maid drops a tray of pickled quail eggs. "They're impossibly restrained," someone whispers, "like a scandal hidden in good grammar." You nod. You agree. Against all logic, against all fiscal responsibility, the socks are perfect. Later, Fauchon walks through the gallery, admiring his own reflection in every surface. But his moment is shattered when a butler runs in, breathless. "There's a messenger," he gasps, "from the Comité des Dettes Aristocratiques. They've sent a notice." You unfold the paper. It's stamped with a seal you recognize. Shh. Maurice. The notice is polite, as always, respectful, but it is clear. The Marquess of Fauchon is now officially considered financially unstable, a title only one step above bankruptcy, and 2 steps below person whose wigs may be repossessed without warning. For a brief moment, the socks dim. Or perhaps it's the candlelight. Fauchon says nothing. He walks slowly to the display box where his earlier socks still rest. The originals, the prototypes, the dreams, and near disasters. He opens the drawer, gently places Les Silencieux beside them, and closes it with a finality that hums in the room. "I will not let them take my softness," he says quietly. You ask what happens now. He smiles. "We plan. The last soirée. A night to remember. One final flourish before the collapse." He pauses, with a dance floor that grips. You want to stop him. You don't. Because deep down, part of you wants to see how this ends too. Preparations begin at dawn. By breakfast, the guest list has been written, rewritten, and eventually tied to a dove that refused to fly and had to be escorted by carriage. Fauchon has declared it la dernière douceur, the final softness. A farewell to comfort, a last defiance before the inevitable. "This will not be a funeral," he insists, pacing barefoot across the dining table for no reason other than acoustics. "It will be a declaration. The end of my credit shall be the beginning of my legacy." You nod slowly, still chewing toast. "And the floor?" He stops. "Imported wool, with a velvet underlayer. It must be soft enough to silence shame." The planning is absurd in scope. Every detail reflects not just taste, but symbolism. The invitation is handwritten on fabric instead of paper. The floral arrangements are comprised solely of soft things, lamb's ear, pale peonies, even a few strategically placed feather dusters. And the music? A string quartet trained specifically to play every piece just slightly slower than normal. So people have time to reflect, Fauchon says, while they sway. He commissions a new outfit, not lavish, but deliberate. It's made from a blend of silk and sorrow, stitched by Etienne himself while he hums lullabies and mumbles about unionizing. But the centerpiece, of course, will be the socks. Les Silencieux, displayed under a cloche of glass until the moment arrives. Fauchon says he will put them on in front of everyone like a knight donning armor. Except, he whispers, with more tact. As the night of the soirée approaches, Maurice reappears. He doesn't knock. He simply appears, as though summoned by the scent of closing credit lines. You find him already seated in the study, flipping through a book he likely brought himself. He looks up. "So, the final softness." He says it like it's a dessert. Fauchon appears, draped in his rehearsal robes and holding a swatch of fabric between 2 fingers like it contains the meaning of life. "I assume you're here to mock," he says. Maurice smiles. "I'm here to witness. And to remind you, the clock ticks." They stare at each other for a long time. You've seen fewer sparks during duels. Fauchon speaks first. "Would you like to attend?" Maurice tilts his head. "To the final soirée of a bankrupt dandy in silk socks?" A pause. "Of course." He leaves, but the threat lingers like expensive perfume. The night arrives, and somehow, impossibly, it is perfect. Guests glide in like memories. Candlelight flickers off glass and gown. The air smells of rose and resignation. There's a string of musicians at the far end of the hall, playing a piece so slow it sounds like it's remembering itself. The floor is divine. You remove your shoes just to feel it. So does the Duchess with 84 parasols. No one questions it. Fauchon descends the grand staircase in silence. No announcement, just presence. Every head turns. He's wearing ivory and morning blue with a silk sash that trails like a sigh. And in the center of the room, the socks. He walks to them slowly. The glass cloche is lifted. He kneels, carefully, reverently, and slides le silencio onto his feet. The room is still. No coughs. No fanning, no chewing. Just a room full of nobles watching a man put on socks like he's swearing an oath. He stands. Someone sobs. Someone else whispers, "God, they shimmer like restraint." And then he dances. Not wildly, not theatrically, but gently. Small steps, slow turns, like someone remembering something they loved and forgot and now can't quite touch. The room joins him. Even you move. Even Maurice moves. Though he does it with the faint stiffness of a man deeply unfamiliar with joy. The night carries on with strange grace. Guests share soft stories, their first glove, their favorite scarf, the time they saw a shadow and thought it was affection. And when the music finally fades and the candles gutter low, Fauchon makes a speech. "My friends," he says, standing by the window as dawn begins to peek like a shy thief, "they may take my estates. They may seize my mirrors, my wigs, and my wine, but they cannot take softness, not truly, because it is a choice, a rebellion, a philosophy." He lifts one foot. The sock catches the morning light and gleams like forgiveness. And then he sits, not theatrically, just quietly. Maurice approaches. He pulls a folded parchment from his coat. "The official notice," he says. Fauchon doesn't even flinch. He signs it, a simple signature, flourishless, calm. "Thank you," he says, "for waiting." Maurice nods. "I owed you that." They shake hands. And you realize that maybe softness isn't the opposite of ruin. Maybe it's how one survives it. You lie in bed that morning with sore feet and a strange sense of peace. Somewhere, a bird sings again. The floor is still warm beneath your soles. The morning after La Dernière Douceur is unnaturally quiet. No shouts for tailoring corrections. No trays clattering with lemon-glazed biscuits. No impassioned monologue about the ethical limitations of velvet. Just birdsong. And the faint rustle of silk as the curtains stir in a breeze that smells like surrender and jasmine. You sit in the library. Because of course there's a library, and of course no one reads the books. Watching Fauchon move through his salon like someone mourning a very beautiful dream. The socks are gone. Not confiscated. Not stolen. Retired. After the final dance, he removed them, folded them delicately, and placed them in a satin-lined box labeled Souvenirs Du. Then he locked the box in a drawer. Then locked the drawer inside a cabinet. Then, perhaps unnecessarily, placed the cabinet inside a locked wardrobe. They were never meant to be forever, he says now, sipping a weak rose tisane. Nothing soft ever is. You glance toward the foyer, where a team of government appraisers has just arrived. They're wearing sensible shoes and expressions that suggest they eat toast without butter. One makes a disapproving noise when they see the gilded bidet in the hallway. They've come to evaluate. Furniture, art, land deeds, decorative hats, all to be cataloged, assessed, and auctioned. The process is bureaucratic and brutal. By lunchtime, they've already put price tags on the piano, the chandelier, and, with some confusion, the ornamental wig stand shaped like Voltaire. Fauchon watches it all with a serene detachment. Let them tally. What they cannot quantify is the elegance of a gesture, the hush before a gasp, the courage of texture. You suspect he's talking about socks again. By evening, most of the Chateau's grand rooms have been stripped of their performative wealth. The East Gallery is bare, except for the dent in the floor where the velvet loom once stood. A lone feather flutters in the draught. You wander into the wardrobe room, half expecting to find a barricade made of lapels and size. Instead, it's almost empty. Only a few garments remain. A single embroidered waistcoat, a mourning cravat, and one folded note pinned delicately to a silk sash. It reads, "Everything else was just decoration. But the socks, le silencio, they're still untouched. No one has dared ask about them. Not the appraisers, not Maurice, not even the cook who once tried them on while Fauchon napped and later described it as a religious experience. At sunset, Maurice returns. He carries with him a simple envelope and the expression of someone who both respects and regrets what must happen. "This is the final ledger," he says. Fauchon accepts it without comment. He doesn't even open it, just places it beside the empty decanter on his writing desk, where it sits like a silent period at the end of a farce. "I assume the estate is no longer mine." "It never really was," Maurice replies. "Not after the 5th embroidery loan." There's a long silence. Then Fauchon speaks. "Will you take the socks?" Maurice shakes his head. "I came for assets, not artifacts." You wonder if he means it as mercy. That night, the chateau is still. No guests, no music. Just you, Fauchon, a cooling pot of tea, and a single lit candle whose flame flickers like it's remembering something. He tells you a story, not one of parties or silks, but of his childhood. A simpler house, coarse wool blankets, a mother who used to knit lopsided socks in winter and call them left-handed dreams. You've never seen him like this. "Maybe it was always about that," he says, voice thin, trying to feel the softness I once believed was waiting for me. You want to speak, to comfort, but what can you say to a man who's already buried his pride beneath 6 layers of monogrammed regret? Instead, you sit in silence, and somehow, that's enough. The next morning, a carriage arrives, a modest one, 2 horses, no tassels, no fanfare. The staff, what's left of them, gathers to see him off. He wears a simple coat, no powdered wig, no sash, and you notice with a pang of emotion, no socks at all. He smiles faintly. Let them air. They've earned their rest. As he steps into the carriage, he pauses, looks back once, not at the chateau, not at the staff, but at you. "Guard the softness," he says, "even if the world laughs." And with that, the door closes, the wheels creak, and the Marquess of Fauchon, the man who once believed ankles were destiny, disappears down the lane into the morning mist. You return inside. You pass the empty salons, the dusty tapestries, the half-packed boxes. And then, almost without thinking, you walk to the wardrobe, open the drawer, lift the cabinet door, unlock the final box. There they are. Still folded, still perfect. Les silencieux, you don't touch them. You just sit beside them. And for the first time, you understand. Sometimes softness is not weakness, it's defiance. And sometimes the quietest things leave the loudest echoes. In the days that follow, the chateau becomes something different. Not empty, exactly, just quieter. Quieter than it was before the silks, before the scandals, before the socks that became legend. The servants have gone, most of them. The furniture has been replaced by pale silhouettes on the floor where sun never quite touched. And the air? It carries the faintest perfume of lavender and endings. You find yourself developing routines. Morning walks through unused hallways. Silent breakfasts beside candelabras that haven't held flame in weeks. Occasionally you pass a mirror and see your own reflection growing strangely noble in the absence of nobility. The socks remain where they were last placed, in their box, in their drawer, untouched. At night, you sometimes light a candle and sit across from them, the way one might sit across from an old friend who doesn't speak anymore, but still knows. Word begins to travel, softly, slowly. Whispers drift in from Lyon, from Paris, even from the minor courts of Belgium. The story of La Dernière Douceur spreads like velvet across marble floors. You hear it told at taverns, at tailors, at salons. "Did you hear?" they say. "A man danced the last of his fortune into a pair of socks." Some claim he wept while tying the final knot. Others say he disappeared into the countryside wearing nothing but his reputation and a light coat of citrus cologne. One poet insists the socks now reside in a monastery guarded by monks who believe texture is a form of prayer. But you know the truth. They're still here, still folded, still unclaimed. And then one afternoon, a letter arrives. Not official, not legal, just folded parchment with a single wax seal. A faint impression of a silk thread curled into a spiral. You recognize the handwriting instantly. It's that theatrical slant. Elegant, over-italicized, and undeniably Fauchon. You read, "My dear friend, if you are reading this, I have successfully survived boredom long enough to find a place with decent lighting and tolerable linens. The countryside is full of peasants who mistake me for a poet. I don't correct them. They bring me pears. Sometimes I miss the weight of fabric, the rustle of embroidered excess. But mostly, I miss the pause between gasps, the moment when the room realizes you've stepped beyond reason. I hope the socks are resting. I imagine them like soldiers in peacetime, polished, patient, and slightly smug. Keep them for me, or don't. Either way, protect the silence they left behind. Fashan, formerly of satin, now of soil. You fold the letter and place it gently into the box beside the socks. The silence in the room feels a little warmer now. Not long after, an unexpected visitor arrives. A woman in a coat the color of stormy lace. She introduces herself only as Beatrice, the textile historian from the sock salon. She carries a worn leather satchel and an expression that says, "I already know more than you'll tell me." "I've come," she says, stepping into the drawing room, "because people are starting to forget." Forget what? That softness matters. She walks past you, slowly, deliberately. Her hand brushes the top of the sock cabinet like one might trace the spine of a sacred book. "I'd like to see them," she says, not asking permission. You open the drawer. She gasps, not dramatically, not performatively. It's the kind of gasp that belongs to a person who's found something they've spent years believing they never would. Oh, he really did it. You watch her reach out. Her fingers stop just before touching the fabric. "I studied these patterns, the dye process, the impossible weave." She smiles. "I never believed anyone could wear philosophy." She looks at you. "These don't belong in a drawer." You nod, slowly. Maybe for the first time, you agree. That night, together, you begin preparing the library. Not to sell, not to hide, but to show. To let others see what obsession looks like when it is honest, what failure looks like when it is elegant, what softness can mean when it has nothing left to prove. You hang the socks, gently, carefully, on a suspended cord between two marble columns. Beneath them, a single placard, "Les Silencieux, Hugh," crafted from silk, regret, and defiance. Last worn at the end of everything. Visitors begin to arrive in trickles. A shoemaker who whispers to his apprentices, "Look there, that is why we never rush a heel." A widow who murmurs, "My husband used to fold his socks like that. I always thought he was mad. I think I was wrong." A child who stares in silence, then simply says, "They look like they're listening." And every evening, as the last guest leaves, you extinguish the lamps, sweep the floor, and sit once more before them. Not to guard, not even to remember, but simply to be near the last quiet thing that still believes in beauty. You don't remember exactly when the socks stopped being his. Maybe it was the first time someone cried in front of them. Maybe it was the woman who brought a sketchbook and drew them over and over with shaking hands, mumbling something about the curve of consequence. Or perhaps it was the man who sat for 3 full hours without saying a word, then left behind a note that read, "I've never been hugged, but now I think I understand." All you know is, they're not his anymore. They're everyone's. The library has become a sanctuary, not grand, not opulent, just soft. The walls are lined not with dusty volumes of uncracked history, but with fabric samples, quiet thoughts, and a growing pile of thank you notes from strangers. And every day, they come. They arrive in carriages, in muddy boots, in silence. Some dressed in finery, some wrapped in nothing but linen and hope. They speak softly. They tread carefully. No one is told to, but they all do. Because the socks somehow command a kind of reverence usually reserved for relics and love letters never sent. You've added seating, plush chairs, velvet cushions, even a rug made from old tapestries that smell faintly of lavender and lemon balm. People sit, and they stay. They don't ask about the Marquess. Not directly, but they whisper about him like a figure from myth. Did he really dance them into bankruptcy? I heard he once wept because a scene was too perfect. Someone told me he kissed them goodnight, and always you smile. Not because the stories are true, but because they're soft in the way truth rarely is. One morning, you receive a parcel, no return address, wrapped in brown paper and bound with a thread of what feels suspiciously like sea silk, the rarest, strangest textile in the world. You open it slowly. Inside, a small book, hand-bound, titled simply, "Notes on Softness." It's written in the Marquess's hand. The pages are filled with observations, some poetic, some bizarre, all unmistakably him. Silk does not ask permission, it simply insists. The space between toe and shoe is where hope lingers. Softness is not weakness. It is strength on mute. You read it cover to cover twice. Then you place it in a glass case beside the socks. The display is growing, but not cluttered. Thoughtful. A timeline of tenderness. There's the letter he wrote you. A swatch of the original die from Madame Murray, a sketch by Beatrice, annotated with textile jargon and what may or may not be romantic longing. And beneath it all, the socks remain unchanged, untouched by light, dust, or cynicism. One evening, a group of students arrives from Paris. They're loud at first, laughing, jostling, skeptical. But when they enter the room, the hush falls. It always does. One of them leans close and whispers, "They look like something someone would wear to remember a love they never confessed." Another says, "They look like apology in thread." They leave quieter than they came. And later that night, you find a folded napkin left behind with a scribbled message, "I wanted to laugh. I didn't. Thank you." You begin to wonder, was this the Marques's plan all along? To turn ruin into reverence? To let softness outlive spectacle? Or did he, in all his foolish, glorious flair, simply want people to feel something real? You start a guest book. On the cover, a faded drawing of the socks with one word underneath, "Listen." The entries pour in. "I came angry. I left slower. My mother used to hem our linens with whispers. I'd forgotten that. Today I wore my best clothes just to say thank you. He made softness louder than noise." And still, each night, you close the room gently. You check the humidity, the curtain light, the scent of the air. You say goodnight to the socks, not out of habit, but out of habit, born from love. And one night, much later, long after the crowds have thinned and the season has turned, you light a candle and sit alone in the room. You reach out, and for the first time in weeks, you touch them. Just your fingertips. Just for a moment. They are softer than you remember, softer than memory, softer than regret. And for the first time in a very long time, your eyes well, not with sadness, but with the quiet knowledge that something impossible had happened here. Something delicate, something rare, and something somehow still alive. That night, after touching the socks, you sleep more deeply than you have in months. You dream not of grandeur or downfall, but of thread, endless silver gold thread weaving itself into shapes you recognize only by feeling. A ballroom sigh, a whispered apology, the way a person breathes when they're finally understood. You wake just before dawn. The chateau is still dark, but the silence has weight. Not the emptiness of abandonment, but the fullness of something sacred. A hush before the first light, as if the world is holding its breath to preserve one final softness. You rise without thinking and pad barefoot through the halls. No candle, no slippers, just the sound of your steps against the cold stone, softened by the memory of steps that once wore silk. When you reach the library, something makes you pause before opening the door. You hear a voice. Not loud, not full, a murmur, low and oddly melodic. You crack the door, heart oddly quickened. Inside, a man stands alone in the half-light. He's older now, thinner. The coat hangs looser. His hair is not powdered but silvered naturally, like moonlight resting where arrogance once perched. But the voice? Unmistakable. Fauchon. He doesn't look at you, just continues speaking. Not to himself, but to the socks. "I hope you've rested," he says softly. "The world has been terribly coarse while I was gone." You remain in the doorway and not wanting to interrupt, not entirely believing. He steps closer to the display, not too close, reverent. "I've met a baker," he continues. "She's as soft as millefeuille and twice as dangerous. She taught me how to knead. Not the way a butler needs velvet to test its defiance, but the way you knead dough when you want it to forgive you for being impatient." You blink. He laughs, quietly. "She doesn't care about socks. Not at all. But she lets me talk about them while we shell peas. That's love, I think." Then silence. He sits, cross-legged like a schoolboy, like someone finally at ease with being grounded. "I didn't come to take you back," he murmurs. "You belong to the quiet now." At last, he turns his head toward you, not surprised, not startled, just knowing. "You kept them," he says, smiling. "I knew you would." You don't know what to say, so you sit beside him, the two of you side by side, facing the socks like pilgrims before a shrine. After a while, he speaks again. "Do you remember the ones before Les Silencieux?" he asks. "The ones with the lilac trim and emotional instability?" You do. "They were trying too hard," he sighs. "Like me back then." He leans back against the wall. "I used to think softness was something to wear. Now I think, maybe it's something you become, eventually." The library brightens with the slow arrival of dawn. Dust motes drift like old secrets. The socks seem to glow, not from magic, but from meaning. Finally, Fauchon stands. "I should go," he says. "There's bread to knead, and someone who frowns when I use words like ephemeral in the kitchen." He moves toward the door, then stops, turns. "Would you ever consider letting people touch them?" You hesitate. He nods. "Right, of course, not yet." And with a faint wink, he leaves. You sit in the library for hours after. Visitors begin to arrive, as usual. Some come with expectations. Some come with stories. One brings a spool of thread and leaves it on the windowsill for luck. But you carry something new now. You've seen the man who once believed his soul was stitched into a pair of socks and found that he still carries softness in his voice, not because of the socks, but because of what they helped him survive. That night, before closing the library, you add something to the display. A small placard just beneath the main one. It reads, "Last seen by their maker, left untouched, again by choice. Softness, returned to silence." A week passes, maybe two. Time feels slower in the library now, as if the room has finally synced itself with the rhythm of the socks. Visitors continue to come, though more quietly. Word has spread beyond fashion circles and salons. Now there are poets, textile monks, and the occasional curious farmer who enters with skepticism and leaves slightly teary-eyed. The guest book is half full, not with signatures, but with sentences, confessions, murmurs, memories. One reads, "My father wore wool socks even in summer. He said it kept his soul insulated. I thought he was ridiculous. Now I think he was onto something." Another, "I used to hate anything delicate. Then my daughter was born." You begin to spend your mornings reading them, letting the quiet honesty settle into your bones like warmth. The socks have become more than exhibit. They're a mirror. And in that mirror, people are seeing themselves softened, layer by layer. Then, one late afternoon, a letter arrives. Not from Fauchon this time. This one is messier, the ink smudged in places, the handwriting somewhere between hurried and embarrassed. You unfold it slowly. "To whomever tends the quietest things, I visited the socks last winter, didn't sign the book, felt silly, thought maybe it was all just a story made too elegant to be true. But then I sat, and I didn't leave for 4 hours. I used to be a soldier. Now I teach children how to sew. I tell them about the socks, not the man, not the fashion, just the moment you realize something soft has survived longer than anything loud. Thank you for keeping them." And you press the letter flat and add it to the wall. Later that evening, Beatrice returns. She appears in the doorway with her usual dramatic scarf and a small wooden box. Her expression is gentler now, as though she too has been spending time with bread bakers and people who don't ask you to explain metaphors over dinner. "I brought something," she says, stepping inside. She opens the box. Inside is a single sock, not Les Silencieux. This one is older, rougher. The dye faded, the heel repaired with contrasting thread, a patch roughly sewn. And yet, it's beautiful in a different way, like a childhood drawing found in a drawer 20 years too late. "I found it in the archives," Beatrice says. "I'm fairly sure it's one of his first. Pre-obsession, before the poetry, just after the first tailor said no." You lift it from the box. The fabric is thinner, but the ambition is there. A small embroidered flourish near the cuff, a swirl that looks like a question mark. "It deserves to be seen," she says. "Not next to them, of course, but nearby, as context." You nod, and together you mount it to the adjacent wall. A new placard reads, "Early softness, imperfect but determined. A beginning nobody applauded, but everyone needs." The socks seem to approve. Or perhaps it's the way the light catches their fibers, but for a moment they appear even softer, grateful to no longer be alone. The following morning, you arrive to someone has left a single rose beneath the new sock. Wrapped in linen, tied with thread, attached is a note. No name. Just, "Thank you for letting the unfinished be beautiful too." The tone of the library shifts, slowly. People begin leaving behind scraps, literal scraps, bits of ribbon, a button sewn to a thank you card, a handkerchief with initials faded by years of pockets and grief. You begin collecting them, not to clean, to honor. They go into a new case. Offerings of softness, not curated, not cataloged, just present. By now, you've stopped wondering what Fauchon would think of all this, because you know he didn't care about fashion, not really. He cared about feeling, about being seen through the texture you chose to wear, the softness you dared to defend, and now others are choosing it too. Later that week, you receive word of a child in Marseille who has begun sewing socks from recycled sailcloth, calling them storm catchers. Their mother says she read about Le Silencieux in a letter someone had copied and passed hand to hand like a bedtime myth. That night, as you close the doors to the library and the evening air hums through the window panes, you light a single candle and sit in the quiet. The socks remain suspended gently between then and now, and beneath them the guest book lies open, freshly signed. The final entry that day simply reads, "I didn't think softness would survive this long. I'm glad I was wrong." The next morning, before you've even finished steeping the tea, a knock echoes through the library's old wooden frame. It's gentle, like someone asking for permission before entering a memory. You open the door to find a young woman holding a box covered in pale blue linen, stitched at the edges with small hand-sewn stars. She looks nervous but determined, like someone who's practiced saying something dozens of times and hopes you won't laugh. "I'm sorry to come unannounced," she says, "but I've brought something." You motion her inside. She walks slowly, her eyes scanning the library, stopping at the socks, lingering there as if confirming they are real. For a moment, you both stand in silence, facing them. The air in the room is calm, reverent. As always, they seem to shimmer more than shine, like they glow in response to attention that isn't selfish. She places the box gently on the guest table. "My grandmother told me about him," she says softly. "The Marquess. I thought she was exaggerating." You smile. Most people do. "But then," she continues, "she showed me this." She opens the box. Inside is a pair of hand-knit wool socks, gray with faint threads of silver woven in clumsily, lovingly. They're not elegant, not refined, but the cuffs are ribbed with care and the toes are reinforced in a way that says, these are meant to last longer than loss. She made these for him, the young woman explains. He never wore them, of course. Too rustic, he said, but he kept them in his study, in a drawer labeled, "If I ever come my senses." You blink. This was not in any guest book. She smiles gently. He wrote to her once a year, sometimes just to say the sky looked like something that ought to be stitched. You lift the socks from the box. They're heavier than silk, but no less honest. You place them on the table for a long moment before turning to her. "Would you like them displayed?" you ask. She hesitates, then shakes her head. "No," she says. "They're not meant for looking. They're meant for wearing. But maybe you can keep them nearby. Let them be felt." So you do. You wrap them carefully and place them in the small drawer beneath the guest book. A drawer few notice, but those who do are the ones who stay a little longer. The ones who whisper thank you, not to you, but to the socks themselves. Later that evening, a storm rolls in. Not dramatic, not violent. Just enough rain to remind you that softness isn't always dry or clean. Sometimes it's damp and honest and a little bit cold at the edges. You light a candle and sit, as you always do, facing the display. Someone has left a teacup on the windowsill with a single sugar cube floating inside, untouched. On the cup's rim is a note. "This room made me miss someone I never met. That feels like kindness." The socks, still suspended, sway slightly in the draft from the chimney flue. You imagine Fauchon watching from somewhere, not heaven, not exile, just elsewhere. Perhaps seated on a worn velvet bench in a forgotten village cafe, sipping mediocre wine and composing letters he'll never send. You hope he knows what's become of the softness he once nearly ruined himself for. You hope he would laugh, or at least raise one perfectly groomed eyebrow and say, well, at least they're being admired properly. Before bed, you open the drawer one more time, touch the woolen pair his grandmother made, and suddenly you wonder, what if the socks that changed the world were never meant to be worn? What if the real softness, the one that outlives scandal, ruin, and fashion trends, was always hiding in a drawer full of someday? That night, the rain continues gently, and the library, as always, stays warm. The next morning, the rain has left a quiet stillness in the air, as if the world outside is waiting for something to happen. The library, though, is alive with the soft rustle of pages turning and the whisper of history still echoing in its corners. You step back into the room feeling a weight in your chest. The socks, still neatly folded in the drawer, seem to have a strange presence, like they're more than just objects now, as if they carry the weight of an untold story, a moment in time that refuses to fade. As you walk past the desk, You notice a familiar sight, the flickering of a candle by the window, the scent of fresh ink lingering in the air. Someone has left a letter behind, tucked between the pages of an old book. You reach for it, carefully peeling the paper open. The handwriting is elegant, almost too perfect, but the words themselves are far more profound than the meticulous strokes suggest. To the one who keeps the stories alive, who sits with history and listens to its quiet breath, I have come to realize that no matter how far we stray from the past, it never truly leaves us. It lingers, like a forgotten melody that hums in the background of our lives. The letter doesn't have a signature, no name, just the words, floating on the paper like leaves caught in a gentle breeze. You sit down, the letter resting in your lap. For a moment, the world outside the library seems irrelevant, distant, muffled. All that matters is the message, the quiet recognition that the past is never truly gone. As you sit there, lost in thought, the door creaks open. It's the young woman again, her eyes downcast as if she's unsure whether to enter or leave. She holds something small in her hands, a tiny delicate object wrapped in plain brown paper. I didn't mean to intrude, she says softly, glancing at the socks once more, but I thought you might want to see this. She places the package on the table and steps back, waiting. You carefully unwrap the paper and find a small wooden box worn with age. It's intricately carved, its surface etched with swirling patterns that seem to tell a story of their own. You open the box and find, nestled inside, a single silk thread, thick but worn, faded almost to the point of transparency. It feels fragile, like it could slip away with a breath. This is the last thread she ever spun, the woman says quietly, before the world took everything from her. You don't ask who she is, you already know. Her name is whispered through the walls of the library, carried by the very air you breathe. You gently take the thread in your hands, feeling its texture, its delicate strength. It's like holding a secret, an intimate piece of history that no one else will ever truly understand. It's beautiful, you say, your voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiles, though there's a sadness in her eyes. It's more than beautiful. It's a piece of a story that no one can forget. You nod, understanding in a way that's difficult to put into words. The past, it seems, isn't just something we learn about. It's something we live with. It's something we carry inside us without even realizing it. You place the silk thread in the box, closing it gently. It's not just an object anymore. It's a memory, a connection. And like the socks, it will remain here in the library, a reminder of the past that will never fade. The woman looks at you, her gaze steady. "Thank you," she says, her voice thick with gratitude, "for keeping it all alive." You watch her leave, the door clicking softly behind her. And once again, you're left alone with the library, the history, the memories, and the socks. The socks that still sit in the drawer waiting for something, waiting for someone to understand them. Maybe that's the thing about history. It doesn't ask to be remembered. It just is. And sometimes it takes a strange series of events, a thread of silk or a pair of socks, to remind us that the past is always closer than we think. You rise, stretch your limbs, and walk over to the drawer once more. This time you open it with a quiet smile. And as your fingers brush against the woolen fabric, you realize some things are meant to stay hidden. Some things are meant to be worn. And some things are meant to be remembered. The seasons begin to shift again. Outside, the ivy on the chateau stones turns brittle, then crimson, then the kind of deep velvet brown that always makes you think of old ink in final chapters. The air smells of baked apples from the village down the hill and distant chimney smoke, as if someone's burning old letters instead of firewood. The library changes too, subtly. Not louder, never louder, but more lived in. The cushions hold the shape of longer visits. The windows fog more often, not from weather, but from breath left behind by those who linger too long before le silencieux and forget the world outside has appointments. And then, on a sleepy Wednesday, one of those days where even the wind seems unbothered, a man arrives with opinions. He sweeps in like a gust of academic certainty, wrapped in a perfectly ironed wool coat and a tie that looks like it judges people. "Where is it?" he asks, without greeting. "The infamous pair." You nod toward the display. He walks past you without a second glance. He stands before the socks with the stance of a critic, preparing to be underwhelmed. He says. So these are the ones that bankrupted a nobleman? You don't answer. You've learned by now that silence can say more than any curated exhibit note ever could. He circles the display, pulls out a notebook, begins scribbling. They're not technically symmetrical, he mutters. Slight variation in the stitching near the upper cuff. Likely intentional, of course. Faux imperfection, very fashionable during the pre-revolution salon period. A bit gauche now. You blink. He doesn't stop. People romanticize these, he continues, glancing around at the guest book, the folded letters, the thread offerings. But truly, they're artifacts of decadence. A man destroying himself in slow motion, 1 foot at a time. You inhale, slow and measured. He steps closer. Really, what could a pair of socks ever teach us? You step forward quietly. Everything, you say. He turns, brows lifting. So you tell him. You tell him about the day the Marquess came back, not in triumph, but in stillness. You tell him about the child who left a single thimble with a note that said, "My father was never gentle, but these help me believe softness exists." You tell him about the weaver who visited last spring and wept openly, because the weave was so perfect it reminded her of her mother's laugh. You tell him about the baker who used to be a soldier, the widow who sewed buttons into handkerchiefs as apology, the quiet hours people have spent here just sitting, because it was the only place they ever felt safe enough to. By the time you finish, the man isn't scribbling anymore. He's just standing there, eyes on the socks. They shimmer, he says at last, softly now. I didn't expect that. No one does, you reply. He nods, then closes his notebook. Quietly, he removes his gloves, places them gently on the nearest bench, and sits. For the next hour, he says nothing, just watches. When he finally stands to leave, he stops at the guest book. He writes only one line. I came to critique. I stayed to remember. You don't follow him out. The door closes with its usual click, and you return to the display. The socks haven't moved. They never do. But somehow they look different again. More sure of themselves, as if they've grown used to being misunderstood. Later that evening, you rearrange the new offering wall. It's grown again, not with lavish gifts, but with quiet ones. Tucked handkerchiefs, soft pencil sketches, 2 poems written on the back of recipe cards. And in the bottom corner, you find a folded square of stiff parchment. Inside is a single sentence. We are all, in some way, stitched from regret and softness. You don't recognize the handwriting. You don't need to. You place it beside the others, and as the lamps dim, as the library returns to its usual hush, you sit once more before the socks, still suspended, still watching. And for a brief, impossible moment, you think they might have relaxed just slightly at the cuffs, like they, too, have been exhaling, quietly, softly, waiting to be understood. By now, the socks have their own seasons. There's the early silence, when the visitors arrive just after sunrise, hoping to see the fabric in the morning light, those first golden rays that make the threads look like they're dreaming. Then comes the midday still, when school groups file in, quiet at first, then louder, then quiet again, as the presence of the socks settles over them like a hush from history itself. And then, in the late hours, your favorite, the evening murmur, when the last candlelight makes the silk glow like it remembers. It's during the evening murmur on a Thursday that someone unusual arrives. He enters with no fanfare, just a soft knock, a worn satchel, and the gait of someone who has walked a long way but doesn't want to talk about it. You look up from the desk. He doesn't smile, doesn't frown, just asks, "Do you still have them?" You know who he means. You nod, gesture gently toward the display. He walks over without a sound. He's in his 60s, maybe older, but his posture holds that strange mix of fatigue and formality that suggests former service. Military, perhaps, or some who tell other people where to stand at parades. He gazes at the socks for a long time. Minutes pass. Then, without looking at you, he says, "He sent me a letter. Once. Didn't sign it, but I knew." You wait. He'd seen me on a street corner. I was wearing wool. I always wore wool. He wrote, "I can see the stiffness in your ankles from across the boulevard. Let them forgive you." The man chuckles once, under his breath. He was right, of course. He opens his satchel and pulls out a pair of socks. They're plain, brown, not worn through, but tired. They look like they've marched places. "These aren't soft," he says, placing them on the table, "but they survived a long time, and I think they're ready to stop." You don't ask his name. You simply nod and accept the offering. Later that night, you tuck the wool socks next to the thread from the grandmother, the sketch from Beatrice, and the linen-wrapped rose someone left last month. The collection is beginning to resemble not a museum exhibit, but a confessional shelf, a place where softness is not performed, but surrendered. You add a small card, worn long, walked far. Now resting, at last. The next morning, the man is gone, but his socks stay. That day, a young couple enters the library. Newlyweds, they say, on their honeymoon. She's wearing gloves that belong to her grandmother. He wears boots that look like they've been through more stories than he has. They sit for hours. She takes notes in a leather-bound journal. He stares at the display like it's explaining something he didn't know he needed to learn. When they leave, they don't say much. But he turns to you just before the door closes and says, "I used to think strength was noise." And then he's gone too. Each day now, the socks seem to gather more weight, not in fabric, but in meaning. You begin to understand that this isn't about luxury anymore. It's about legacy, not the kind you put in a will, but the kind that gets whispered between people on long walks. That evening, you light the lamps one by one. The socks shimmer gently, as if nodding. You sit in your usual chair, the guest book open on your lap. Today's entry, written in pencil with a slightly uneven hand, reads, "I never knew my father's voice, but I think it would sound like this room." You close the book and let the quiet settle. You don't need to speak, because somehow the socks are saying everything. The first snowfall arrives without warning. It doesn't announce itself in clouds or wind. It simply appears as if the sky decided it was time to soften the world in one quiet motion. The grounds of the chateau disappear beneath a layer of white that mutes every sound, every step, every breath. Even the creaking old shutters seem subdued. You wake early to find frost tracing the corners of the window panes in the library. It looks like lace. Delicate, elaborate. A message in cold script only the socks might understand. Inside, it's warm. The hearth crackles softly, and a pot of spiced tea steams on the desk. A visitor is already waiting. She doesn't speak, just nods toward the socks with the kind of expression that says she's been thinking about them for a long time. Her coat is worn wool, lined with something that might have once been satin. She carries a rolled-up canvas in one hand, tied with rough string. You gesture toward a seat. She doesn't take it. Instead, she moves to the display and kneels, not reverently, not dramatically, but with the honest stiffness of someone who has worked with their hands for years and still treats fabric like a form of conversation. She unrolls the canvas. Inside is a painting, not of the socks, but of a pair she imagined existed before them. Rougher, louder, more foolish. Bright red with gold thread, overly tasseled, a riot of color and ego. The first pair, she says simply. The ones that tried too hard, that didn't know softness could whisper. You kneel beside her. It's garish. It's beautiful. It's exactly right. "I'm a costume designer," she says finally. "Or I was. Theater, mostly traveling companies, always searching for something that could hold a character without crushing them." She touches the edge of the canvas. "I once worked on a production where we tried to capture the Marquess in 3 acts. The script made him a clown. But I knew there was more. So I painted these for myself." You nod. You understand. Together, you mount the painting beside the offering shelf. Not because it's part of the sock's story, but because it's part of the softness around it. The before. The ambition that stumbled, the echo of someone becoming themselves, stitch by stitch. The visitors that day are quiet. They often are during snowfall. One leaves behind a string of paper cutouts shaped like feet, each with a different word written across the sole. Grace, failure, hope, again. You add them to the growing archive of softness. Later, as twilight folds itself gently over the land, you light the fireplace. The snow continues, turning the world outside into one long pause. You pull up your chair. The socks shimmer faintly in the firelight. They seem almost warmer tonight, as if they remember cold days like this. As if they, too, once waited for someone to return with a story and cold fingers and a lesson learned the hard way. You open the guest book, now thick with scribbles, sketches, notes left in every language. Today's most recent entry is scrawled in charcoal pencil, shaky, maybe written while standing. "They told me softness was weakness, but I've never cried looking at steel." You close the book gently and sit back. And in the hush of the snow, the crackle of flame, and the shimmering fabric hung just above eye level, you realize the socks no longer belong to one man. They belong to anyone who has ever fought to remain gentle in a world that rewards sharpness. To anyone who's ever stitched their pride into something fragile and said, "This is still me." They are not just socks. They are a choice. And tonight, surrounded by snow and silence and the flickering memory of theater, of painters, of forgotten first drafts and red-threaded failures, you feel it in your bones. Softness will outlast the storm. It's the kind of winter that lingers too long. Snow no longer feels magical. The stillness outside has become too still, like the world is holding its breath but has forgotten what it was waiting for. You keep the fireplace going from dawn till night. The floor creaks more loudly now. Even the silence has a bit of an ache to it, like it needs a shawl. And yet, inside the library, the socks remain untouched. Untouched, but not untouched by meaning. People still come, though less often. The cold keeps many away. But those who arrive come with purpose, not curiosity. They don't ask questions. They don't take photos. They come to sit, to remember, to breathe near something that has endured. You begin to notice a new kind of visitor. They don't leave notes. They leave mending kits. Little bundles tied with string, needles tucked into scraps of felt, spools of thread, swatches of cloth cut from old shirts and table linens. Some are pristine, others clearly used. Every one of them left with quiet care at the base of the display, like tributes not to the socks themselves, but to the act of keeping something soft alive. You start placing them in a special glass box labeled simply, "For those who stitch." One evening, as dusk slides its lavender light through the frost-lined windows, a small girl arrives with her mother. She's no more than 7, maybe 8, bundled in a coat 4 sizes too big and mittens that don't quite match. The girl stands before the socks for a long time. She doesn't fidget. She doesn't ask why they're behind glass. She just looks. And then, quietly, without prompting, she speaks. "My teacher says people wear armor to keep things out. But maybe socks are like armor to keep something in." Her mother's eyes widen. Yours do too. The girl shrugs, pulls out a tiny drawing from her coat pocket, and hands it to you. It's a pair of socks drawn in crayon. They're multicolored, lopsided, and covered in stars. One has a heart, the other has a lightning bolt. They're for feeling big feelings without anyone seeing. You ask if she'd like you to add them to the collection. She nods. You frame the drawing and hang it in a corner near the guest book, beside the old wool pair from the soldier and the rose from the woman whose grief had no language. You title it, "Child's Socks, Drawn During a Hard Year." Function, emotional containment. A few days later, you get a letter, postmarked from a city far north, typed, clean, clinical, on paper that smells like ink and logic. It reads, "To whom it may concern, I represent the family estate of Marquess Émile de Fauchon. It has come to our attention that certain personal items, now widely known as Le Silencieux, remain on display in your care. While we understand the public interest, we formally request a discussion regarding the repatriation, proper preservation, or academic relocation of said artifacts. Please respond promptly. Regards, Émile Fauchon, 4." You read it twice, then fold it neatly and place it unopened in the drawer below the socks, because you already know they are not returning to any family vault or museum archive. They are already home. They live here now, not as objects, but as memory, as emotion, as invitation. Later that evening, you sit beside the fire and watch the socks sway ever so slightly in the room's warmth. They seem to be listening. You whisper, "He has a grandson." You pause, then smile, allegedly. And you imagine Émile IV, perfect posture, immaculate boots, walking into this room one day and seeing not just his ancestors' ruin, but his recovery. Not a pair of socks, but what they held up, pride, collapse, tenderness. The proof that softness not only survives shame, it transforms it. That night, before closing the library, you open the guest book. At the very bottom of the page, someone has scribbled, "Some armor is loud, some is silent. Mine is made of thread and trying again." You close the book, blow out the lamps, and as the last candle flickers down into memory, the socks remain, not colder for the winter, but warmer for every story stitched into them. By late February, the library has become a kind of quiet pilgrimage. Not a tourist site, not a trend, but a place people find their way to when something inside them has frayed. They come without fanfare, often alone, always with stories they carry not in their hands, but in the subtle hunch of their shoulders, the long exhale before they sit. You start recognizing patterns. The ones who linger near the offering shelf always have something folded in their coat pockets. The ones who sit beside the socks without blinking tend to leave without speaking. But later, you'll find a napkin with a scrawled memory tucked into the bookshelves. The ones who cry usually smile on the way out. One visitor arrives late in the evening, a man in his 40s with snow still melting from his boots. He's wearing a sweater that looks handmade, like someone loved him once with yarn and time. He doesn't look at you as he enters, just heads straight to the display. He stands there for a long while, hands in his pockets. Finally, he says, "My brother and I used to fight over who got the good socks in the winter. We'd race down the hallway, and whoever got to the drawer first got the ones with the reinforced toes." You wait. We didn't speak for 5 years after he left for university. I sent him one message, like just a photo of my feet in the old socks. He smiles. He replied in 2 minutes, said, "They're mine." He chuckles, the sound more memory than amusement. Then he hands you something, a single sock. Soft, worn, not beautiful by any aesthetic standard, but full of something else. Something heavier, something healed. You place it in the offering shelf. Add a small label. Sibling reconciliation, wool blend. Message successfully delivered. You don't know his name. You don't need to. That same week, a package arrives. No note, no return address. Inside, a pair of socks, not silk, not wool, not any luxury. They're made from scrap fabrics, bits of old uniforms, apron-old uniformers, denim. One heel is visibly stitched with the word try. The other cuff reads, again. You display them immediately. They don't shimmer, they pulse. Visitors stop and stare at them almost more than Les Silencieux now. One woman calls them the softest socks I've never worn. You name them, the patchwork pair, constructed from failure, mended with stubborn hope. Then something strange happens. A group of textile students arrives, fresh-faced, skeptical, carrying clipboards and expectations. They poke and prod with their eyes, murmuring about weave quality, tension, fiber blend. Then one of them, barely 20, sits down on the rug. Just sits, cross-legged, silent. She pulls off one shoe, then the other, and starts crying, quietly, into her hands. Her classmates freeze. You step forward, but she shakes her head. "I'm okay," she says. "I just didn't expect them to know I was tired." You nod. They have that effect. When she stands, she places her shoes beside the patchwork pair for a moment, not offering them, just letting them be near each other. Then she leaves. You find her entry in the guest book later that evening. It reads, "I thought I wanted to design socks, but now I want to design forgiveness." The next day, you polish the glass of the main display, not out of obligation, but out of reverence. The socks shimmer as always, gently, firmly, like a truth that doesn't need to shout. Les Silencieux, still hanging, still listening. And somehow, despite everything, despite frost and floods and family lawyers, they seem stronger now. Not in thread count, but in story count. That night, as snow begins to fall again and the hearth sighs into the floorboards, you add one last card beneath the patchwork pair. Softness is not a trait, it's a decision. And some decisions are made over and over until they hold. You dim the lamps, close the guest book, and in the hush that follows, the socks sway slightly. Just enough to remind you they are not waiting to be touched. They are waiting to be understood. It happens quietly, as most important things do. No trumpets, no heralds. Just a folded piece of paper slid under the door one morning, resting there like it belonged all along. You unfold it. The paper is thick, the handwriting sharp and precise, exactly the sort that expects to be taken seriously in government offices and courtrooms. We hereby inform you that the exhibition Les Silencieux and Other Soft Artifacts has been nominated for permanent National Archive status under the Cultural Heritage of Living Memory Act, Section 13B, amended. A government representative will arrive to assess the collection for official registry. Please prepare accordingly. Cordially, Comité de Préservation Non-Tangible. You read it 3 times before whispering, "Oh no." Not because it's bad news, but because you know what happens when the official world comes knocking on the door of something fragile. They'll want measurements, They'll want provenance. They'll want labels with precise years, woven sources, and verified intention of the artist. And you'll have to tell them it's just a pair of socks. And also it's not. The inspection is set for 2 weeks from now. You start preparing, not by dusting or tidying, but by walking the library slowly, letting your hands trail along the edge of every offering, every folded note, every small mercy left behind by someone who once needed the quiet. You reread the guest book. You reframe the drawing by the child who described her socks as emotional containment. You check the lighting, adjust the cushions, add an extra log to the fire even though it's too early in the day, and then you sit in the stillness, letting the socks shimmer beside you, because this is not something to defend. It's something to witness. Visitors still come, unaware of the letter tucked in your coat pocket. Today, it's an older couple. They walk in holding hands. The woman's coat is quilted, hand-stitched, with years of wear in the elbows. The man has that look of someone who used to fix things without instructions. They stand in front of the socks and say nothing. Then he turns to her and asks softly, "Do you remember when you knitted mine?" She nods. "You wore them to propose." "And they had a hole," he smiles. "Yes," she laughs. "Right in the heel. I was mortified." He nods toward Les Silencio. "He would have worn the hole proudly," she replies. "He would have called it vulnerability." They leave a photograph on the offering shelf, a sepia-toned image of their feet side by side in 2 mismatched socks. On the back, just 3 words, "Still warm, still us." You frame it without hesitation. That night, you sit by the fire again. The socks hang above the hearthlight, silent and present. You reach for the letter from the committee and trace the edge of the page. The words "non-tangible preservation" feel too cold, too distant, like trying to trap fog in a bottle. You consider responding, explaining. But what would you even write? They're made of silk, yes, but also regret, and second chances, and quiet revolutions. Instead, you add a new card beneath the display, just 1 sentence. "If you're looking for meaning, bring your own silence." Because maybe that's all anyone really needs to understand the socks. Not dates, not categories, not credentials. Just a willingness to listen to what was almost lost, to what survived because someone cared enough not to walk away from softness. Later that night, just before bed, you find a small envelope placed beside the guest book. Inside, a strip of woven fabric. Tiny. Almost nothing. The kind of trim used inside sleeves where no one would ever see it. And a note, written in cramped script, "I never learned to say I'm sorry, so I stitched it over and over." You press the fabric gently between your palms, then you place it beneath the socks. Not for show, for safekeeping. Because this place, this room, this display, this impossible pair of socks has become more than an archive. It's become a sanctuary for those who never knew where to place their almosts, and now they do. Right here, right beneath the silence. The government arrives on a Wednesday. Not dramatically, just 2 officials in navy coats bearing clipboards, neutral expressions, and the faint aroma of bureaucracy. They introduce themselves with practiced clarity. One is named Delacourt, young, fresh-shoed, the type who tightens their tie every time they prepare to use the word infrastructure. The other, older, moves slower, speaks less, and carries a leather portfolio worn at the corners. You don't catch their name. They stand in the library for several minutes, quietly scanning. Not the socks, the room, the offering shelf, the guest book, the candlelight, which you've carefully dimmed just enough to catch the glimmer of Le Silencio, but not so much that the corners feel like shadow. You stay still. They begin their process. Measurements, photographs, questions. Many of them awkward, like trying to dissect a lullaby. Do you have provenance for the silk thread used? Was the Marquess known to have formally endorsed the exhibit? Has this display ever served in a diplomatic context? You answer each one as best you can, sometimes truthfully, sometimes gently, often with silence. When they ask, what precisely is the value of this artifact, you simply say, how long do you have? Delacourt seems unsatisfied. He checks a box, writes something briskly, but the older official lingers. Not with questions, just proximity. He stands in front of the socks with his hands folded behind him, as if remembering something personal and not entirely welcome. Eventually he speaks. My wife once told me, he says softly, that I looked most honest in my sleep. I asked her why. She said it was because I always curled my toes when I dreamed. You don't reply. He turns to you. She knitted me a pair once. Too small. They left a mark. I wore them anyway. He doesn't say anything else, but before he leaves, he gently places a single button on the offering shelf. Blue enamel. Worn. Precious only in the way something must have been held onto for decades to still exist. You frame it that evening next to the embroidered apology strip. The label simply reads, "For curling toes." As the day ends, the officials leave. Delacour nods briskly. Expect our response in writing. 3 weeks, perhaps 4. You close the door behind them, locking it not because of fear, but because some silences deserve protection. That night, you light the fire a little earlier. The frost on the windows makes delicate spiderweb patterns. The socks, warm in their glass display, seem to glow in response. Visitors trickle in slowly. One is a woman who says nothing, just unrolls a tiny scroll on the floor. It's blank. You ask, "What is it?" She shrugs. "All the things I almost said when I was younger." You place it near the child's drawing. Another visitor is a man who carries a pair of thick hiking socks, patched, sun-faded, and uneven in length. "I wore these through grief," he says. "They weren't built for it, but they held on." You nod. "Would you like to leave them?" "No," he says. "I just wanted them to meet these." He places them beside Les Silencio for a moment, rests his hand on the glass, then takes them gently back. You say nothing. You understand. That night, just before closing, you notice a new entry in the guest book. Written in a steady, almost calligraphic hand, "We arrived looking for preservation. We left remembering how to be human." Cultural Preservation Officer, you close the book slowly. Let the fire burn down to whispers. And as you sit alone in the stillness, the socks hanging above you like memory made visible, you realize this place was never about preservation. It was about permission to feel, to mend, to remember that even the most delicate threads, when stitched with intention, can outlast centuries of noise, and that sometimes all it takes to keep something alive is to let it rest gently in the quiet, right here, between the warmth of a fire and the hush of knowing, right beneath the silence. The letter arrives earlier than expected. Thick paper, embossed seal, delivered not by post but by hand, slipped into the doorframe with such care it almost feels whispered. You recognize the handwriting on the envelope. It's Laferre's, the older official. You open it by the fireplace while the first guests of the morning are still brushing snow from their shoulders in the vestibule. It reads, "To the Curator of Quiet Things. The committee has completed its review. We debated structure, we debated cataloging, we debated briefly the legal classification of socks as artifacts. But what we could not debate was this. It moved us. The socks, the room, the space between the breath and the seeing. This is not a museum, and it is not an archive. It is something rarer, a place where memory doesn't perform. It rests. Therefore, we have granted Les Silencio a unique status, living artifact of public softness, the first of its kind. You are not required to digitize them. You are not required to explain them. Simply keep doing what you're already doing. Let the socks remain what they are, a soft place in a loud world. With quiet admiration, C. Lefebvre. Ministry of Cultural Presence, retired, as of this morning. You fold the letter slowly, your breath caught somewhere between awe and relief. You read it again, then again, and then, quietly, with no audience, you laugh. A small, disbelieving laugh, because somehow the impossible has happened. They've been seen, not as novelty, not as scandal, not as historical oddity or fashion footnote, but for what they truly are. You press the letter flat and place it in the glass case next to the scroll of unsaid things and the hiking socks that needed no audience. The label reads, "Official Recognition Letter. Proof that softness can outlast protocol." That afternoon, the visitors arrive in pairs. An elderly man and his son, a painter and her deaf friend, who runs his fingers across the glass and nods like the socks are speaking directly to him. A girl and her grandmother, the older woman telling stories in whispers, while the girl sketches each thread with a pencil no longer than her finger. You light more candles than usual. You let the fireplace burn brighter, and when one visitor asks, "Can I sing to them?" you nod without hesitation. She stands before the socks and hums a lullaby. The notes are old, wordless, from a place where words might have failed too often. The room listens, even the fire pauses. When she finishes, she bows, not to the crowd, but to the socks. She leaves without a word, but you find this note later, written on the back of a bus ticket. They reminded me of my mother's hands, not what she did with them, just how they held me. You place it near the guest book. That evening, the sky burns gold behind snow-heavy trees. You sit in the stillness. The socks shimmer as they always have, subtle, sure of themselves, deeply unbothered by recognition. They didn't need it, but perhaps they deserved it. You reach for the drawer where the earliest offerings are kept, the first scraps of cloth, the drawing from the child, the thread from the grandmother's hands, and you begin to write new cards. Not for the museum, not for documentation, but for them. This sock held grief and gave no splinters. This one stitched a marriage back together. This ribbon once wrapped a box of apologies. It was kept. And below Le Silencieux, you add one final line. Not worn since the last dance, but carried daily by everyone who left softer. Outside, night falls slow and silver. Inside, the socks do not glow, they rest. Confident now that softness doesn't need defending, it only needs shelter. And you, quietly, have built one. Snow melts slowly in March. It leaves behind rivulets along the stone paths, the kind that glisten under morning sun like leftover threads unraveling across the earth. The garden outside the library exhales for the first time in months. Tiny green shoots press up from soil as if asking, "Is it safe yet?" Inside, the warmth holds steady. Firelight, tea, cloth, memory, and socks, of course. The socks remain, still, suspended, immutable in their quiet, as if untouched by time. But you know better. You've learned that softness can evolve without changing shape. You see it in the way people approach them now. Slower, more reverent. Less curious, more known. On a rainy Thursday, an unexpected visitor appears. She's small, very small, maybe 10 years old, wearing a bright yellow raincoat 2 sizes too large and boots that squeak when she walks. Her name is Lucille. Her father stands behind her, sheepish, mouthing silently. She insisted. Lucille walks right up to the socks. She doesn't ask permission. She doesn't ask questions. She simply stands, head tilted, eyes wide, like she's trying to remember something she's never been told. You wait. Then, after a long silence, she turns to you. "They're not lonely," she says. You blink. "No?" She shakes her head. "They're full." She rummages through her coat pocket, pulling out a small square object wrapped in blue tissue paper. She unwraps it carefully and like it might be alive. It's a sock, or half of one. Child-sized, clearly handmade. The yarn mismatched, the stitches loose and uneven. "I tried to make one," Lucille says, "but it's hard." You kneel beside her. "It is. It takes time." She nods. "And patience. And you have to start over a lot." She hands it to you with 2 hands, solemn as a ceremony. I think they'd want it nearby. You place the unfinished sock on the offering shelf. A new label is written in crayon, Lucille insists. Not finished. Not perfect. Just trying. That evening, the room is unusually warm. Not from fire, not from sun, but from the quiet residue of someone who believed wholeheartedly that trying was enough. You light 1 extra candle. The socks shimmer gently in its glow. A few days later, you receive a package, unmarked. Inside is a small bundle of newspaper clippings, aged and yellowed, all referencing the Marquess of Fauchon. Some are from fashion columns, others from court records. One particularly dramatic headline reads, "Lord of the Loom, Fauchon's Fall from Velvet Grace." At the bottom of the bundle is a torn scrap of parchment, no signature. Just the words, "He wasn't tragic, he was precise. He chose softness in a time that punished it." You mount the quote on the wall above the newspaper clippings, high enough to hover over the spectacle. The message is clear, the fall was not the point. The choosing was. Spring rolls in slowly. New visitors bring new offerings. A musician leaves a harmonica. I wrote a lullaby after seeing them, my first without lyrics. A woman leaves the sleeve of an old blouse. This touched my son's forehead the day he was born. It still smells like first. A young man kneels quietly, places a strip of gauze and whispers, "This kept me alive for 1 more hour once. I want it to rest now." You place them with care. You don't categorize them. You just listen. And each night when the door closes and the fire quiets down to a single exhale, the socks remain. Not just on display, not just remembered, but companioned. by everything unfinished, unsaid, unstitched, by every apology wrapped in fabric, every confession held in thread, every brave first attempt at softness that the world never asked for but so desperately needs. Tonight, as the candle burns low and the windows glow with the promise of coming light, you sit again in the chair. Not as curator, not even as witness, just as someone lucky enough to sit near them. Still hanging, still listening, still forgiving. The first rain of true spring arrives like a held breath finally released. It doesn't pound or punish, it settles. A fine mist soaking the stone walkway, darkening the corners of the courtyard, drawing quiet music from the gutters and ivy. Inside the library, the socks hum gently in the flickering light, as if they know the season has turned and are content to simply remain. You wake before dawn, not because of noise, but because of stillness. That perfect kind that only happens when the air and your thoughts are in perfect balance. You wrap yourself in a soft shawl and step barefoot into the library. Everything is exactly where you left it, but it feels different, like the room itself has exhaled. The offerings, now too many to count, have begun to take on a life of their own. A rhythm. A logic that makes no sense on paper, but is absolutely clear to anyone who stands in the room long enough. There are no plaques directing visitors, no velvet ropes, just one quietly understood invitation. Come in. Bring whatever softened you. Leave something behind if you want. Take something invisible with you. That morning, a pair of sisters arrive. They carry a small wooden box between them, handcrafted, stained with age, with a faded blue ribbon tied around the clasp. You offer them tea. They refuse it gently. Instead, they walk to the display and set the box beneath the socks. You wait. Eventually, one speaks. Our grandfather was a tailor, she says. He made uniforms during the war. He once said the hardest thing he ever sewed was the hem of a burial shroud, because he couldn't get the thread to lie flat while he cried. The other sister opens the box. Inside, a single wooden spool, nearly empty, with a short strand of navy thread still clinging to its edge. This is all that's left of the thread he used. He kept it, said he never wanted to forget that cloth has memory. You nod, and without speaking, you take the box in your hands, turn to the shelf, and find it a place. The card you write is simple. Navy thread, 1943. Proof that even uniform stitches can carry grief. The sisters don't linger. They stay for exactly 7 minutes, then leave, shoulders straighter than when they arrived. You find their guest book entry later. He would have hated the socks, but he would have wept for what they've become. You close the book and sit again in your chair. The day passes in quiet waves. A gardener comes by, mud on her knees, hands like bark, and leaves behind a small bundle of seed packets. For when the time comes, she says, you tuck them into the corner of the offering shelf. They don't need a label, they're a promise. A writer arrives just before closing. He doesn't speak, doesn't sit. He simply stares at Les Silencieux and then folds a torn page from his notebook, placing it beneath the glass dome that once held the socks during their final dance. You wait until he's gone to read it. It says, "You reminded me that softness isn't the absence of edge. It's the decision to put the knife down before cutting." That night, as the fire dwindles and rain continues to fall softly against the glass, you walk barefoot across the rug, run your fingers along the case, and say nothing. Because nothing needs to be said. The socks hang, as always, unchanged in shape, overflowing in meaning. And tonight, they look almost like they've gathered something around them. Not a shadow, not a halo, but the weight of having mattered. Not because they shimmer, not because they're silk, but because they were chosen, danced in, ruined by love, and then offered without defense to the world. As you dim the final candle, you pause at the door and look back. And for the first time, you feel the room say something back to you, not in words, just in presence, just in peace. And you know, there will never be a last visitor. There will only ever be another person making their way, quietly, toward the softest place they've ever found. The days grow longer now, not dramatically, but inch by inch, golden light begins to linger in the corners of the library. It touches the windowsills longer. It reaches the floor in slow, honey-colored lines, casting the socks in a glow that feels less like display lighting and more like affection. You notice the change in people, too. Where once they entered heavy, shoulders hunched, eyes scanning, hesitant, They now walk in as if arriving home. There's less whispering, fewer apologies, more deep breaths. One afternoon, a woman arrives with nothing in her hands. That, in itself, is unusual. Most visitors come bearing something, a note, a scrap of fabric, a memory. She comes empty. She walks straight to the display. She stands there silent for almost 10 minutes, then turns to you and says quietly, "Can I ask them a question?" You nod. You can. She steps closer, presses one hand gently to the glass, not firm, just a resting palm, and whispers, "Am I still soft enough to begin again?" The room holds its breath. You do too. She closes her eyes, then opens them, then smiles. She doesn't need an answer. She already heard it. She leaves nothing behind. But you'll remember her as one of the loudest stories the Sox ever listened to. Later that week, a man visits with a guitar strapped to his back. He doesn't remove it, doesn't strum it, doesn't even speak. He just sits, eyes fixed on the Sox for the better part of an hour. When he finally stands, he takes from his pocket a guitar pick, worn smooth at the edges, and places it gently on the offering shelf. You don't ask. But when he leaves, you read what he scribbled on a note card left behind. They reminded me of the silence between notes. That space is where all the feeling lives. You place the pick in a small velvet pouch beside the harmonica from weeks ago. The display is no longer about socks, really. It's a map of soft returns. A dried rose for a mother who once sang lullabies. A teaspoon wrapped in ribbon from someone who lost their appetite for anger. A single ballet slipper too small to fit anyone now, but placed with the reverence of a holy relic. You begin to understand, Les Silencio are not the only softness being preserved. They are simply the first to be believed. And belief, it turns out, is contagious. One afternoon, a group of teenagers comes in, loud, rolling their eyes in that way that suggests they were dragged here by a teacher who still believes in the power of beautiful things. But slowly, one by one, the noise fades. One of them, a tall girl with chipped black nail polish, stares at the Sox for a while, then asks, "Do you think they ever made him feel stupid?" You pause, then nod. "Yes, probably, but only because he cared so much." She nods back. "Yeah, that makes sense." She doesn't leave anything behind. But the next day, you find a scrap of notebook paper tucked beneath a bench. It says, "I thought being soft made me a target, but maybe it makes me a signal. To others like me." You frame it, hang it low on the wall where only people who sit on the rug will see it. That night, before closing, you walk to the Sox. They sway faintly in the evening draft. They've become quieter lately, but not with age, with assurance. They no longer ask to be seen, they simply are. Soft, steady, true. You look around the room at the offerings, the empty chairs, the slowly filling guest book, and feel something ancient and bright settle in your chest. You don't have a word for it, but if you did, it would rhyme with peace, and maybe forgiveness. You turn off the lamps one by one. Let the last light catch the silk, the Sox now a constellation hung just above reach. And in the hush before the door closes behind you, the room speaks again, not in voice, but in invitation. Softness lives here, still, and more than ever, it welcomes you in. The first day without visitors feels strange. It's not silence you're unused to. This place was built on silence, but absence, a quiet without footsteps, without coats shaken out by the door, without the soft clearing of a throat before someone decides to cry. You move through the room anyway, like always. Light the fire, check the case, dust the offering shelf gently. Everything is as it should be. The Sox hang unchanged, but somehow they feel more still today. Not neglected, just resting, like a candle after a long vigil. You sit down with the guest book. The last entry was 3 days ago. I've started writing letters again. Some I'll send, some I won't, but every one of them begins softer now. You run your fingers over the ink. It's barely dry. You wonder where they were sitting when they wrote it. Maybe at the edge of the rug, maybe cross-legged, knees aching. Maybe standing just long enough to write it down before they change their mind. And then you hear it, a knock. You open the door. No one. Just a small bundle wrapped in an old linen handkerchief, left carefully on the top step like an offering to a saint no longer officially canonized. You bring it inside and unwrap it slowly. Inside a ribbon, perfectly plain, the color of wet stone. Tied to it is a note, short and trembling. I tied this in my hair the day I forgave someone who never said sorry. I think I'm ready to let it go now. You place it beneath the socks. No label this time. Some things don't need titles. Some things speak loudest in a whisper. As you finish, the door opens again. But this time, someone is standing there. A man, older, sharp coat, walking cane. You almost mistake him for a government official again until he speaks. I knew him, he says. You don't ask who. You already know. He walks in slowly, eyes scanning the room with the distant ache of memory. Not nostalgia. Reverence. I was very young, he says. He was older, louder, softer than anyone dared be. You nod. Let him take his time. He stands before Le Silencio and exhales. It's the kind of breath people take before telling the truth. He gave me a handkerchief once, he says. I was crying after a letter I never got. I tried to hide it, pretend it was the wind. He didn't say anything, Gur says, just handed me the handkerchief and said, You don't need to be loud to be felt. He smiles. I thought he was being dramatic. A pause. I was wrong. From his coat, he pulls a small envelope, hands it to you. Can you keep this here, he asks. Not to display, just to be near. You accept it. He doesn't wait for a response. He turns and leaves without another word, as if what needed to be said had already hung in the room for years. That night, after closing, you open the envelope. Inside, one folded page, written decades ago in elegant handwriting you've seen once before, in a letter sent from a village signed formerly of satin, now of soil. The page reads, If you're reading this, it means I was seen. Thank you for keeping the softness safe. These socks were never about fashion. They were about trying again with grace. You refold the page with hands that now feel more like caretakers than curators. You place it in the drawer beneath the earliest offerings. Right next to the unfinished child's sock, the apology stitched into linen, and the single teacup filled with names no one dared say aloud. The socks shimmer faintly in the firelight. As always. As ever. You sit beside them until the flames turn to coals, until the shadows soften into sleep. And just before rising to turn off the last lamp, you look one last time at the display and murmur, You were never alone. And this time, you're certain they heard you. 27 week passes in a kind of gentle quiet that feels earned, not empty. There are visitors, yes, but fewer. And they stay longer, speak less. It's as if everyone can feel it. The story of Le Silencio is beginning to settle, not ending, not closing, but reaching that rare kind of stillness that comes after a truth has finally found a place to rest. One morning, as you prepare the hearth, you discover something peculiar. Tucked into the corner of the offering shelf, half hidden beneath a woolen scrap, is a small notebook, handmade. The cover is stitched from canvas. Inside, pages filled with short paragraphs, some finished, many not. Some crossed out, some rewritten over and over. At first, you think it's a journal. But as you read, you realize it's a script, a play, half-formed, half-abandoned, yet undeniably centered around him. No name given, just the one who danced too soft. Each scene is short, vignettes, really. Moments of absurd beauty. A man arguing with a shoemaker about whether cobblers should attend poetry readings. A scene where he tries to describe silk to someone who has only ever worn burlap, using metaphors that begin with weather and end in weeping. A monologue about ankles, love, and how sometimes we only learn to stand tall by letting our heels slip. You read every page, seated cross-legged by the fireplace, tea going cold beside you. It's raw, it's imperfect, it's wonderful. You place the notebook in the case, not as an artifact, but as a continuation. A new card beneath it reads, Unfinished play, author unknown. Perhaps softness isn't something you watch, perhaps it's something you help write. That same afternoon, a quiet woman in her 50s enters with a book under her arm. She walks directly to you and says, I translated it. You blink. Translated what? She opens the book. Inside, the script rewritten line by line in another language. I work with the blind, she says. I read them your guestbook entries out loud. One of them cried when I described the socks. She pauses. Another asked what they felt like. You nod slowly. I told him, they feel like someone who still believes in you. She places the book beside the script. No note, no name, but you add a card. Translation. Touch as a form of belief. That evening, a poet visits. She doesn't tell you she's a poet, but you know the moment she pulls a worn fountain pen from her pocket and begins writing "sh" in the air, watching the words form invisibly as if they might land between the socks and her breath. She leaves nothing behind, except a poem written on the fogged-up window by the bench. You wore silk, while I wore silence, and both of us were louder than they expected. It evaporates within the hour, but you write it down before it fades. That night, you return to the socks one more time. The fire is nearly out. The room is dim but warm. You don't sit. You stand, as he once did before descending that final staircase. You watch the silk sway ever so slightly, touched by heat, time, and the 100,000 words it has absorbed without ever once needing to reply, and quietly you say, I think we've done it, haven't we? You've been remembered, not as ruin, but as rhythm. And for just a breath, just the briefest flicker of candlelight on glass, you swear they gleam just a little brighter, not for you, not for show, but because at last they are not holding the weight alone. Not anymore. The morning air smells like damp stone and violets. Outside, the trees are beginning to bloom, the first green hints peeking through winter's brittle gray. There's birdsong again, not loud, not urgent, but tentative, as though even nature is unsure how to begin anew after such long quiet. In the library, the rhythm holds. The socks, les silencieux, remain where they've always been, suspended, unmoving, eternal. But today, they feel less like relics and more like elders. They have seen enough, heard enough. They no longer need to prove anything, and neither do you. By now, the offering shelf is full, not crowded, just complete. The wall above it tells a story stitched together from fragments, thread and paper, fabric and grief, laughter and threadbare resolve. It's no longer a display. It's a collage of becoming, a map for how people find their softness again. You light the fire, boil the tea, open the door, and someone new enters. She's very old, the kind of old that makes people whisper in rooms like this. But she walks without help, her hands tucked inside a shawl the color of dusted lavender. She doesn't look at you. She walks directly to the socks. Then she curtsies. It is not a dramatic gesture. It is not for attention. It is one human's formal acknowledgement of another's endurance. I made socks once, she says without turning. For my husband, before he went off to war. You remain silent, she continues. He wore them under his uniform, said they made him feel like he wasn't just a number, said he felt like a person again. A long pause. He never came home, but the socks did. She reaches into her shawl and pulls out a small bundle. 2 socks, perfectly preserved. Not elegant, not showy, just kept. I've held onto them long enough, she says. You take them in both hands like a priest receiving a final offering. She smiles softly. Let them rest here. I think they'd understand each other. You find a space on the shelf. Write a small card. Worn once. Sent across an ocean. Returned with the shape of a person inside. She sits on the bench for a while. When she leaves, she kisses her fingers and presses them to the glass beneath Lencieux. The socks do not shimmer, but something in the room shifts like a chord resolving. Later that day, a boy comes in, maybe 15. He fidgets with his sleeves, his eyes stay low, but when he sees the socks, something settles in him, like gravity aligning. He walks up to the offering shelf and places a single shoelace, frayed blue, stained with paint, next to the lavender socks. You ask, would you like to leave a note? He shakes his head, then whispers, they helped me stay, just long enough. That evening, you sit before the display, hands folded in your lap, the guest book open to its final page. One line, written in pencil, fresh. I think softness is what happens when we survive with tenderness intact. You copy it gently onto a card, frame it, hang it above everything else. Because somehow, that is the title of the room now, not museum, not gallery, but a space where survival, memory, grief, and joy are held softly and stitched together without needing to be explained. You close the guest book, close the door, and sit one last time before the socks. They don't shimmer. They don't speak, they just are what they've always been, not protection, not performance, but permission to hurt, to hope, to be wrapped in softness and know you are still whole. There's a kind of hush that settles over a place once it knows its purpose has been fulfilled. Not abandoned, not forgotten, but fulfilled. The socks hang the same as ever, still and luminous, but they seem less like a centerpiece now and more like the room's heartbeat, steady, unobtrusive, essential. It's nearly dusk when the door opens again. You expect a visitor, but instead, it's Maurice. He enters quietly, without coat, without cane, without that telltale aura of polished danger he once wore like perfume. His clothes are simple now, well-worn, honest. He carries nothing. You hadn't seen him since the night of the final soiree, when he stood in the shadows and witnessed beauty threaten to bankrupt pride. He steps inside, removes his gloves, and stands in front of the socks for a long while. His expression is unreadable, but not cold, just reverent. Then he speaks. "I used to collect what people owed," right, he says, "but this is the first debt that paid itself forward." You say nothing. He continues. "He made a mistake, of course. Several, in fact, lavish ones, but he meant every thread. And I suppose, in a world full of posing, that alone was worth something." He pulls a small envelope from his inside pocket. No wax seal, no crest, just a letter. "For the drawer," he says, handing it to you. "He wrote it. Years ago. Asked me to hold on to it. Said he didn't want it read until the room was no longer about him." You accept it. He turns to leave, then pauses at the door. Without looking back, he says, "He died soft. Happily. That's all anyone needs to know." The door clicks closed behind him. You stand alone in the library, envelope in hand, unsure if your hands are shaking because of grief or grace. You take a deep breath. You do not open the letter. Not yet. Instead, you walk to the drawer, the one that holds the original offerings. The first apology stitched into linen, the drawing by a child, the teacup of unsaid names. You place the envelope there, you write no card for it. Some things don't need to be shared, they just need to be kept. That night, as the wind curls around the chateau and dusk folds itself like a shawl around the windows, you prepare the room for a gathering. Not a formal event, not an exhibition, just a return. You send out a handful of invitations, not printed, not posted. Just small handwritten notes slipped into books, coat pockets, journal bindings. "If you were once softened here, come back and bring what bloomed." They arrive slowly. A baker with flour on her sleeves. A writer with hands ink-stained and tired. A child now grown, carrying the drawing she once left behind, corners crumpled from years of safekeeping. They sit, they speak quietly, some cry, one sings. And when the night deepens and the candles flicker their last, someone, no one remembers exactly who, asks, "Should we take them down?" Everyone turns to the socks. Les Salons floating, still whole, still listening. You rise, approach the case, and without drama, without announcement, you open it. You remove them gently, carefully, reverently, like lifting a memory-made cloth. The room holds its breath. You don't pass them around, you don't display them. You simply fold them, place them on the bench, and say, "They've done enough, let's let them rest." A few visitors touch the bench as they leave. Not the socks, just the cushion where they now lie. As if to say, "Thank you," or "Good night," or "Me too." That night, after the room empties and the fire dies to an ember, you close the drawer softly. The socks stay on the bench, folded, finally still. Not because their story has ended, but because the world finally knows how to continue it.